It is very much my pleasure to welcome Hannah and Beth. Hannah Jacobs is the Digital Humanities Specialist at Duke Digital Art, History and Visual Culture Lab. Her work has been very much focused on conducting and representing historical research via data and visualization. And she's also working on project management in digital humanities. And she has been working also quite a lot on pedagogies within digital humanities and visual interactive storytelling, and hence, you know, the presentation that we are going to have here today. And then Beth Fischer is the postdoctoral fellow of digital humanities at Williams College Museum of Art, where she helps the faculty, students, and staff to find ways to integrate digital tools and projects into their work. And they came together as a very powerful, I will say, you know, team to actually combine their expertise and founded the digital project Handbook in 2018 that basically gathers and share essential information in terms of the steps needed to plan and execute a digital project. So I really hope we can learn loads of things today, and we welcome you from our Digital Scholarship Lab here at Lancaster and also online. So this is a hybrid event. So thank you very much. Up to you.
Thank you so much. And it wouldn't be a hybrid or virtual event without some kind of technical difficulties. So thanks again. So we're going to talk a little bit today about the Visualizing Objects, Places, and Spaces, a digital project handbook. And before we get started, we just want to acknowledge that our workplaces are on the ancestral homelands of the Mohican people, whose community today is known as the Stockbridge-Munsee community, and of the Haliwa Saponi, and Occaneechi Band of the Saponi Nations, whose lands are now known as Durham, North Carolina. This acknowledgement reminds us of the significance of place, even in a digital project, and of our ongoing need to build a more inclusive and equitable space.
So Hannah and I began working together as part of the National Humanities Center's Summer Institute on Objects, Places, and the Digital Humanities in 2017. Participants in this institute, which was sort of jointly done by Duke University and the National Humanities Center, were mid-career scholars, but who were just starting to incorporate digital humanities into their research and teaching. And our work together on that project inspired what became the handbook that we are now sharing today.
So what we're going to do is introduce the project and talk a little bit about the background, how we got started with the project, and also walk through the project and talk about the platform that we chose, PubPub.
So this kind of came out of that, that workshop that I mentioned. And as we were working with faculty, we saw issues coming up over and over, and we would always try and find resources that were already available. But we found that there were a lot of resources out there for people who had already decided on a particular digital tool or approach, and then a lot of resources that sort of leaned on the theoretical side of the digital humanities. And we had difficulty finding resources that were really structured around helping people evaluate their options and think about structuring a digital humanities project. So tutorials often assume that you already had a data set or that you wouldn't be working in between programs that didn't help across that gap. So that gap was really what we wanted to address rather than replicating anything out there. And this was especially true for projects that involve visual resources, which happened to be our specialty. So our solution was an open modular web publication that addresses questions of workflow, resources, and to some degree, basic computational principles, the things that underlie certain kinds of approaches. We focus on explaining logistical and planning questions around setting up a project, about choosing tools, about explaining the trade-offs and pitfalls that are most common in different types of digital projects, like issues that might be especially common if you're working on quantitative analysis or creating a digital archive. We really avoid writing tutorials or making recommendations for specific tools. The available tools, and especially the tools that are free or low cost, change frequently, and the resources that might make a tool approachable at an entry level at one institution don't work at it for an independent scholar or vice versa. In addition to information about how to plan projects, we decided to include case studies and assignments. These were contributions from other scholars who write about their workflow and the resources they use in real situations. And these show the kinds of trade-offs and adjustments that are made in project structure to accommodate different needs and limitations in the real world. As I said, we limited our scope to projects that study objects and spaces and to projects that use visual and interactive modes to communicate scholarship. This is our area of expertise. We also saw a lot more resources that were directed toward text-centric projects, and we wanted a resource that really centered art history, visual culture, and media studies research questions rather than treating those as just additional sources of material.
So our audiences include both those new to digital humanities and those who are beginning a new digital humanities project, even if they've maybe have already worked on a project previously. They could be researchers or instructors, or they may be students at undergraduate or graduate levels. We also aim to make the handbook a resource for practitioners providing consultation, collaborative development, and other forms of research and teaching support. We both had experience working on a wide variety of projects, as Beth has mentioned, and at a variety of different scales as well, and in different roles. So everything from being consultants to project managers to graduate students working on projects. So in addition to consulting on digital humanities projects, I in particular brought experience managing institutional digital resources, teaching technologies, and collaborating on digital humanities projects with faculty and students. And Beth has taught in multiple institutions and in museums, and also has experience as an editor of a Born Digital Art History journal. So we've had no funding for this project to date, and the time that we've allocated for it has been part of our regular work responsibilities, which has really been a boon to us.
So we began discussing this project way back in, 4 years ago now, I think, as we were still working with the fellows at the Institute. We just realized that it would not be feasible for the kinds of one-on-one consultation we were doing with people to happen for a larger group, but that there was a lot of interest in this kind of thing, and a lot of people self-directing digital projects. So what you see here is the timeline from a project that where we published it quite early and have continued to update it. So even though there is some core content that we'll get to in a little while, it's really we've been publishing it as fast as we write it, or as fast as other people write it and we have it edited. So you see that we started thinking about this in the fall of 2018, spent most of that winter and spring testing out platforms, and Hannah will speak a little more to our choice next. Went into content creation that following summer, just as I was moving from North Carolina to Massachusetts. So that was when we became a remote collaboration. And then that fall, we were able to put out some material and start soliciting material from other people as well. We have since shifted to quarterly submissions as we continue to create content and communicate about this.
We released the first stage of the project in late 2019, and this included peer-reviewed content that we had written, and then also starting to ask for submissions of case studies and assignments. And we'll talk a little bit more about the structure of the handbook in a moment. But we weren't finished, and we're actually still producing content for the handbook. So that's something that has been important to us, and that we'll also talk more about, is releasing a project early before it's really finished or polished and ready to go. But also wanting to, even as we're producing our own content, bringing in content from potential authors. We now accept content on a quarterly basis, and we'll take a look at some of that in a few minutes. In terms of the platform, we were looking for something that would be open access, that would be relatively simple to maintain, and that could provide a number of benefits to both authors and readers. So thinking about things like being able to offer DOIs to authors, while also making it possible for readers to access materials, maybe download them in a variety of formats, maybe provide licensing so that readers could reuse some of the materials, particularly from the assignments that are submitted. So we landed on PubPub, which comes out of MIT, and at the time it had only recently launched. So we've, as our project has been growing, PubPub has also been growing and changing. So we've been sort of shifting our workflows along with PubPub, which has been a good learning experience too. PubPub is open access, it's open source. It's developed by an academic institution for academic use and designed to be an open publication platform. They've really expanded the types of publications they support as well, anything from online journals to book projects to conferences and conference papers. They have a number of peer review and attribution tools, and the review tools in particular and version control kinds of tools have really grown over the last few years. They also have robust citation tools, and they offer a certain number of DOIs for free, and then after that you can purchase DOIs from them at a pretty reasonable price. They also have a number of exportable file formats, and this was one of the pieces that we were really thinking about in terms of creating what we might think of as a handbook, being able to select particular pubs and then print out or work with in a PDF format or in another format, just the selections from the handbook that are relevant to a particular project team. And then they're also committed to sustainability. They have a promise that this is a long-term project for MIT, that there will be long-term support, and knowing that we don't necessarily have the capacity to host something ourselves in the long term, that was a really important choice for us.
So next we are going to show you the live site a little bit, and we practiced this with Hannah sharing, so I will do the best I can to keep up. Let's just make sure now, is the handbook, live handbook showing on the screen now? Just want to make sure that it let me switch tabs properly. Okay, so you're on the home page of the handbook. Maybe I'll just, we purposely kept this pretty simple, but you see here the framework that we chose for this. From the beginning, we said that we wanted to be coming at this from the point of view of what research questions people might have. And really thinking about this as I mentioned, we started with people who are mid-career scholars who had complex research questions and were very methodologically advanced, but who were new to the digital side. So we were imagining them coming in with research questions already formed and looking for the digital ways to explore those research questions. And so we thought about the kinds of digital approaches that were most common in our fields, thinking broadly about visual studies, material culture, art history, and things like that. And we came up with these 7 project types. We have descriptions of each of them, and I'll pop into one of them in a moment. But thinking about things, is the primary question they're asking something about dimensional objects? Is it something about storytelling and narrative? Is it something about networks and relationships among different entities? Is it a question about time or about space? We saw these as not only being different types of questions, but of having unique workflows and issues that arise because of the kinds of materials they concern and the types of tools you typically approach with them. So the dimensional project type talks about the trade-offs between complexity and accessibility for the platforms that you can use for viewing 3D models. But we stopped short of making a recommendation about which might be best, knowing that it would be different for each project. The narrative project guide, on the other hand, covers issues like how to storyboard a non-linear narrative. In each project, though, we kept the same structure and addressed the same types of concerns. So those would be our, let's see, I can go into one of these to show you that. This is the problem of trying to navigate live. So you see a description of that. Within each project, we have individual stages, and these are the same for the same topics for each project type. So planning, budgets and funding, tools and resources, teams and expertise that you might need to consult, timelines and workflows, prototyping or wireframing a project, documenting a project, and then maintaining or sustaining a project. So the idea being that we can help people think about the questions they need to answer at every stage of a digital project, including when they might stop working on it and what happens next. Our goal, as Hannah mentioned, was to make this as modular as possible, recognizing that it's common for digital projects to include multiple approaches. So an archival project might start by collecting content and then include a narrative or temporal interpretation. So by keeping these structures very similar, we made it easier to sort of put together your own pieces from different sections. So I'll just drop into one of these, the first one. So this is a pretty simple design. We have not over-designed it in part for sustainability, but also for that exporting. So you see some information about how to plan an archival project. Now, if you can navigate through this and read it and export it and get the next one. So there's some navigation in there, but one of the critical areas that Hannah mentioned was this ability to cite it, to see everybody who's worked on that, and then to download in multiple formats. And that's part of why we've kept this very document centered, is that somebody, we sort of envisioned somebody coming in, downloading the parts that were relevant to them in a format that they could mark up themselves or edit for a specific project. You know, that it might be able to be gathered into a handbook that was specific to a unique digital project for somebody else. So that way we could kind of work with projects like that. But again, this is still working very much in this space of what the imagined digital project is like, speaking in very general terms. And it's always different to see what that looks like, you know, in the real world, more or less. So, so that was where we came up with the idea of case studies and assignments. And I'll hand it over to Hannah to talk about that.
Great, thanks so much, Beth. So if you want to navigate, if you don't mind, to the case studies page, and we'll take a look at some of these. So we had mentioned, so we have kind of multiple areas of the project, and the project stages and project types is one area that Beth and I have authored with peer review, and we've actually credited the peer reviewers. So when you go in and read through the project types, anybody besides us is named as a peer reviewer, which is a way to give credit. One of the things that PubPub can do is actually define different types of contribution roles, and you can also create your own. So you can say who is an author, but you can also say that somebody was a peer reviewer or they contributed a particular aspect, and it's a way to be really specific about providing credit, which has been really invaluable. And then with the case studies, these are actually submitted by scholars, and these are about particular projects that they have worked on. And the idea here is to provide examples to really break down the method and the resources behind different types of projects. And there are a variety of scales represented here, as well as the different project types. So we've got projects from students, we have major multi-year large team projects, and each one essentially just shows under the hood. It's the kind of reverse engineering idea, or how did they make that type of idea that Miriam Posner had posed quite a while ago. It's something that I've always been very interested in, and so being able to provide that is a really great resource, I think. Beth, if you scroll down to, I think it's the Mina Loy case study. It's just a little bit further down, yeah. So we wanted to walk through what case studies look like and just talk about the structure a little bit. We start out by describing the team. So each case study has a formula of a set number of fields. When authors submit, they actually create a PubPub account and then copy a template that we provide and insert their information. So we start out with who the team is, and the formatting of this varies depending on the authors and the size of the team and how they want to describe everyone. But this is another way outside of providing authorship information to define, okay, first of all, who are the people working on this project? Where are they? What are their roles within the project? And then we, of course, provide the project, access to the project. So it's typically a URL. Sometimes there are files that can be uploaded and then downloaded from here as well. And this project, the Mina Loy project, is a multimedia scholarly book project. There's a lot of content that has gone into this project, and quite a lot of time and energy and resources. And so I wanted to start with this one just to show kind of a larger scale project. Folks can include screenshots of their project or images from the workflows that they used, and we might look at some of that as well. If you scroll down, Beth, so we have a project abstract where they describe their research goals with the project, the background for the project, and show, as I mentioned, some screenshots. And here actually is a screenshot of a timeline. So we recognize that case studies don't necessarily fall into a particular project type, so they will actually be linked to multiple project types. We'll just keep going. This one has a number of screenshots included. And so we also talk about the time needed. So we ask folks to give the time span, right? So how long the project, when the project began, when it's projected to end, or if it's ongoing, and then we calculate the length of time, right? This is something that I find with consultations is really helpful to talk about. Is someone will come with a particular idea and really talking through, okay, well, what's the actual time commitment? You know, how long might it take? It does depend on other resources, but being able to point to a project and saying, well, this project was done, but it really took this amount of time, helps people to plan from the beginning. We also ask them to talk about outcomes and to be really specific. And this is a little bit different from the abstract in the sense that it helps to define kind of, they might have created a website. In this case, they have a white paper, and they have a really active social media presence as part of the project outcomes. And there might be other kinds of outcomes as well that are mentioned. And then we ask folks to talk about the resources, in particular the tools that they use, and we try to get folks to list them in as much detail as they have, so that although we are not providing tutorials of tools, readers can see what kinds of tools are being used and get some sense of, okay, what are the complexities? So in this case, it's a WordPress site, but they've helpfully explained, you know, all of the different plugins that they've used, as well as some of the additional tools that they've used to make the website. And they also talk about, in some cases, the types of tools they use for process. So things like Hypothesis for web annotation for teams and things like that can be really useful. Funding is a really key part, and we ask folks to just share what they're comfortable sharing here. And that, in this case, also gives a sense of, okay, how much money is actually needed to create a digital humanities project at a particular scale. So when folks are willing to do this, it's, I think, a really important thing for everyone to be able to see. And oftentimes we will have projects that will mention a particular external grant, and then they may also talk about the internal grants at their institutions. So in this case, there's a particular grant that was received through Davidson College, which one of the collaborators is based at. And being able to see that here provides some resources for folks to also go back to their institutions and say, you know, hey, do you have any kind of internal grant program that might align with this particular program? It's just a great example in terms of institutional infrastructure. And then we ask folks to talk about their workflow. And this, again, it can range from a very short sort of list to talk through all of the steps that they went through, or they can be very detailed. And in this case, the team was very detailed about everything that they went through from the beginning sort of 3-year phase through to 2020. And oftentimes, particularly with the large grants, they'll break it into grant years, and sometimes they can even break it down into months to talk about all of the steps that they went through. And then at the very end, we ask them to talk about challenges and opportunities and what they've learned, essentially. So what kinds of things changed between the beginning of their project and the current final form can be really helpful just to understand, okay, we started out with this idea, but by the time we reached the end of the project, this is actually what it had become. And sometimes that has to do with the ways that technologies are changing. Sometimes it has to do with the development of the research question, or some combination of those two things. And then sometimes they'll offer lessons, right? What do you wish you had known when you started? What would you tell people who want to start a project like this, like a multimedia book project? And in this case, they've given us some very helpful, I think, guidance in terms of talking about realistic limits, or maybe scoping, talking about collaboration. And actually the last thing that we'll ask folks to do is if they have a, oh, they have a number of lessons. This is one of our longer pieces. We'll show a different one that's much shorter. So we asked them about next steps, if they plan to continue supporting the site, what their plan is sort of longer term, if they're going to spin off another project from it. And then also to ask about publications and presentations so that folks can go and see if they want to, maybe a recording or read a paper that covers more about the scholarship behind the project. And in this case, they also had a very long contributor list, so we put that at the end for them. Sometimes this is listed on a separate website, sometimes they choose to pull that in. So that's one example. And so this is the kind of large scale, big end of things when we get a case study. If we go back to that case studies page, or actually, yeah, Beth, if you want to pull up the anchor hold afferents, we'll take a look at that one. So this is a very different project. It was largely done by a single graduate student with assistance from some folks at her institution. So if we scroll through this, we'll see it's slightly different in scale, both in terms of the amount of content that she provides, but also in the types of resources that she's working with. So she provides also video here in this case to explain what her project is. In this instance, it's a VR experience. She was thinking about Julian of Norwich, who is a medieval woman scholar and devout Christian who essentially spent the majority of her adult life in what was called an anchor hold, so a very tiny confined space. And what the student wanted to do was to reproduce this idea of an anchor hold and to provide this kind of experience so that viewers could think about, okay, what would it be like to live in this tiny confined space for the majority of one's life with very limited access to human contact. So she produced this and then was able to talk through with this publication her process. So it's a much shorter timeline. In this case, February 1, 2019 to present was, I think, about a year by the time that she had submitted. And then she talks about the resources that she had used. So she talks about both in this case, the tools, but also the VR studio. So some infrastructure that's available to her at NC State University. And just the amount of time that she spent actually learning how to use the Unity gaming engine that she used to produce the VR experience. And yeah, so this is a good example with funding where there wasn't a whole lot of cost in development other than what was already available through the institution. So making that also really clear when we're just working with existing institutional resources versus needing to find external resources. And then again, she walks through her workflow. And sometimes these are much more narrative as well. Sort of reflecting back to on what was done. And she provides some screenshots too of the process and how she built the VR environment, kind of the external views of it, and then eventually getting into the interior that she created and showing use in the classroom. So actually she produced this and then used it in a class that she taught. And so also talking about creating that for student use. And again, very similar structure to our previous. And then actually, so just to show the sort of range of media files that can be worked with, she did actually embed an interactive version of the anchor hold here. So PubHub can handle a number of different iframe formats as well as media files. And that's likewise been a really important part of being able to show and link to projects, especially projects like this one, which may not have a long-term web presence, but we can have some sort of record in image form or in a kind of interactive form that can be accessed through this publication. Beth, if you can scroll back up to the top of this, maybe we'll take a look at some of the metadata. So I mentioned that each hub has a DOI. That is available at the top along with the citations. And then on the right, there is the download button. And maybe if you'll click on that briefly. So we mentioned a number of different formats. I just want to highlight that it really is a range of formats that are available. We don't have control over this piece, actually. And it's something we've communicated with PubHub about quite a bit in terms of the formats that they provide and how the transition from a web view into, say, a PDF works. And they are really quite good. And for particularly the assignments that we'll look at, having an editable version can be helpful if a project is licensed under Creative Commons, and then someone can download some of the material from the assignment and actually just edit that to be used with their class. So with that, let's look at an assignment briefly, just to show the difference. And I think we'll look at the one from Nena, if you can go down to, yeah. The Archiving Women and Slavery in Virginia. So this was a single author project as well. And oftentimes our assignments are, although not always, we do have instances of assignments that are submitted by graduate TAs or by consultants. So staff consultants oftentimes are also co-authors. This is one example that I want to show because with assignments, we ask for some slightly different information. So first of all, in addition to asking about who the author is and their role in creating the assignment, we ask about the learning objectives. So what is it that they want the students to do, both generally, and then also what are the technologically dependent learning outcomes? So what makes it a digital assignment, essentially? Why is the digital necessary? And I feel that this is a really important question to ask because there are times when maybe the technology is not necessary, right? And we might think about when it is actually important or critical to an assignment. If you scroll down, Beth, I think we'll get to skill level as well. So talking about what kinds of prior knowledge do students need to do an assignment, and then describing the assignment after that. So giving essentially an assignment abstract. And then like with the case studies, the assignments will go through each one of the resources as well as lessons learned, essentially. So what kinds of things they might change in the future. One thing that's missing from this particular assignment that we make available for other authors is there wasn't really any kind of, there weren't any files available to be downloaded or any kind of other materials that folks could learn from. Essentially, the assignment here is describing a process that then could be implemented at another institution. So sometimes with assignments, there are actually, they'll provide, say, a handout that accompanied the assignment or some other kind of worksheet. And then readers can actually download that and use that in their own classes. We do ask about how assignments are assessed as well. And so that's what this section here is about, just to give readers a sense of, okay, when you're reading through a digital project or considering a particular assignment, what are the things that different authors are looking for when they're assessing student work? Yeah. So that's one example of an assignment. And as with the case studies, the template stays pretty much the same for each assignment. Sometimes there are specific changes that we'll make, and it depends on the author and their needs. But I know that we are coming down on time. So Beth, perhaps we could talk about next steps.
Sounds good. So we're continuing to write core content, particularly for the spatial, networked, and quantitative project types. I think that we'll be able to still publish the spatial section as part of our next update when we publish more case studies and assignments right around the beginning of the year. One thing we are really working on at this point that we're excited about is linking between case studies and assignments and project types. So Hannah mentioned that case studies and assignments fall into these project types. In most cases, they fall into more than one. And if you go to a project type, we do tell which projects, which assignments and case studies are related to that kind of topic. But what we don't do is link directly between specific parts of an assignment or case study and the content. So saying, here's a really good example of a funding model for an archival project. So that's something we'd like to be doing more of. We are working on several new collaborations. These are sort of ways of connecting our project into larger projects, but also bringing in some special topics that we're interested in that don't fit into this. So we're in the middle of one on copyright and rights generally for digital projects. And if anyone's curious, we're happy to speak to more about that. And perhaps most importantly, we continue to have open calls for case studies and assignments on a quarterly basis. So we strongly encourage you to get involved. Hannah, do you want to speak to that?
So on our website, there is a Get Involved page that describes how you can submit an assignment or case study and walks through the difference between the two. We're also very much interested in receiving feedback. So we have had peer reviewers for different sections, and we'll be looking for peer reviewers again for the spatial section and for eventually the networked and quantitative sections, which are remaining project types to publish. We're also always looking for feedback on user experience. So any kind of comments are absolutely welcome. And I believe the last slide has the links for folks to follow. In addition to the website and being able to contact us via email, we now have a newsletter via a Google group. It's really low traffic. We're aiming for maybe 3 to 4 communications per year. But if you're interested in learning more and just sort of keeping up to date with the project, we encourage you to sign up as well. So thank you so much for listening, and we're happy to take questions for the remaining time.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Beth and Hannah. That was really, really fantastic. So in the meantime, while people think about questions in general, so Catherine has shared already the link, so you can have it in the chat already. But I was wondering, I mean, I think the project is really fantastic, right? So you are capturing all the kind of knowledge and know-how that normally gets lost, right, while you actually creating, a project. And I think that is invaluable because it's not only, I think, about recording how we do things, but also the methods and I think all the management aspect of projects and the know-how of that is lost. So, it's just fantastic that you have created this space to actually capture this information. I was actually wondering, how did you design your own project? Did you, do a kind of like co-creation workshop with, scholars around, or how did you come up with that?
So this sort of started because I was already writing a lot of the content just to share with the people who are in our institute. That was set up as a multi-year workshop where the participants came together for about a week each summer and did hands-on workshops, but then went their own ways back to their own institutions for their year in the middle. And I was actually brought into that project in the second year because there was a recognition of a need for ongoing support through the project cycles. But I was really supporting people remotely and just realizing the need for thinking about that and recognizing that the kinds of questions weren't ones where I could send someone a link, because of this focus on process and, well, how do I navigate this specific situation at my institution with my timeline, with these goals? And they weren't technical questions, they were project management questions to a large degree, and recognizing that need. And, as people coming out of an academic background, we are not only not accustomed to think of that for digital projects, we are not typically accustomed to thinking of that for our other projects either, quite frequently, unless you get to the point where you are, a PI on a large grant or something like that. And so we recognize that was both particularly important for digital projects, and also that many of us had not been trained to do it for any part of our workflow. So I would say that was a big part of it. Hannah, do you want to speak to sort of what we did next? Because I think you were the one who was like, this has a bigger audience, we need to do something with this.
Yeah, so we went through kind of, we went through a number of sort of ideation phases together, and we created lots of very messy diagrams trying to figure out what it was we wanted to do and how we wanted to structure it. And actually the results of that, there is a diagram on our About page that we didn't show that tries to explain sort of the concept and the connections. But we also worked with the lab at Duke, the Wired Lab, now the Digital Art History and Visual Culture Research Lab, and received some great feedback initially from that team. And then because we were producing content early on and publishing that pretty early, we received some great feedback from our peer reviewers. And we actually just went through a user experience phase over the summer, and so we actually will have some changes to implement based on that too. So it's kind of it's ongoing. I wouldn't say like we haven't, it's not the final product yet.
No, I found it really fascinating, particularly, we work on the creation of historical gazetteers, right? And there is so much knowledge, I think, that gets lost when, everyone goes around, these kind of projects doing their own thing. And if you are lucky, there are some books, of course, and there are some journal articles that talk about the process of creation, but not necessarily in the detail and, kind of like in the systematic way that you are capturing there. So I think it's just, a fantastic resource in general. And I also think that it's a fantastic resource as well for teaching, because, when you come across these kind of projects as a master's student or, as a PhD student, just to have a sense of how do you start with it. I think it's just fantastic. I don't want to, take all your time, but do you have any question here that you want to ask, or, our online audience as well can ask questions? Is there any question in here that you want to ask? So I do have another question, if you don't mind me. What are the common challenges that you identify, across different institutions to initiate and to maintain, let's say, a digital project? And I know that this is a huge question, but you have worked with many different institutions with many different types of projects. So I always wonder, what are the main challenges that you find?
Sure. So I think from my perspective, it's consistent support. So a lot of projects are web-based, and much of the project takes place in terms of developing the project and then producing some sort of web application or platform. And then sustaining that over time is always a challenge. Finding the resources that will sustain it. I'm finding in my work that oftentimes we want to be specific about how long a website is going to persist, or how long staff can reasonably support a website, if there are staff available to actually ensure that a website stays live and usable. So I think that honestly it's an infrastructure, but it's actually a human challenge and not a technological challenge.
Right. That's so interesting. Sorry, go on.
From my perspective, I would say that scope change is one of the biggest problems that I see. And people will say, well, we're not going to change the scope, and you always do. And so figuring out how you're going to cope with that is one of the biggest barriers, I would say. And sort of, if you get too locked into the idea that your scope won't change at all, you can't roll with it when it happens. So building in some of that expansiveness from the beginning. And I'd say that that's from the beginning, that was part of why we didn't limit ourselves to sharing projects that were totally completed. Digital projects have a different life cycle, they have different maintenance and sustainability, but we still have this attitude toward publishing things that feel complete. and just recognizing that most digital projects and even assignments aren't really ever complete until they're taken down. And at that point, how useful is it to talk about it? So I think from the beginning, we really wanted to highlight that piece of it quite clearly. And so we do accept submissions from things that are not complete. We ask that there be a significant amount completed, enough to have learned some lessons. And we ask that for assignments that they've actually been taught in a classroom. But we want to share that change over time piece.
Yeah, no, I think it's really fascinating. So we have some comments and questions in the chat. So I'm going to just start with the question by Catherine. Have you encountered any challenges with managing this project alongside your day jobs?
Yes. Definitely. I think we definitely have support. In my instance, I have some unofficial sort of research time that I can use, but of course, that research time can get taken up by other things very easily. So we're starting to get into a rhythm, I feel, particularly with the quarterly submissions. But yes, it can be kind of a challenge to manage that.
Yeah.
Yes, definitely. Yeah, and I think that is, that is one of the things that the last 2 years in particular have, for obvious reasons, been critical for. And I think one thing I've seen over that time is that other people understand that better. That the idea that we're working on these alongside, and things like moving and changing jobs, certainly change, like, okay, I might have to do nothing on this for 3 months at a time while I'm doing this other project, and really recognizing that. But at the same time, doing this project alongside our day jobs, I think makes us very sensitive, continue to be very sensitive to the exact kinds of problems that were why we wanted to build this project, which was talking to people who were saying, how do I make this work with my life, with my limitations, with my opportunities? Both of us, Hannah is currently a grad student again, after having been a grad student and not been a grad student and been a grad student again. We started this project when I had just finished my dissertation. And both of us were quite used to under-resourced projects, and what can you do by yourself, and wanted to find a way to tell people, here's how you decide whether you should take some of your very, very limited money and pay somebody to do this, or whether you should take some of your very, very limited time and learn how to do it yourself. And that there are always guides to how to do something, but not guides to tell you about whether you should do something.
Yeah, I'm conscious of it, the time, but I would like to ask you one more question, because, I think it's such a fantastic project what you have there. Have you thought how much this should be a kind of like national project? In a way, we are thinking quite carefully here in the UK, for instance, about the infrastructure that we put behind digital humanities projects, but projects in the arts and the humanities in general, right? And so this is starting to be seen precisely as knowledge that should be captured at a national scale, instead of like just individual projects and institutions. Have you a thought about that? Like how this could work, for instance, with the National Endowment for the Humanities?
I don't think that that's come up for us before, but it's a really interesting question that I will think about. I think part of our some of our new collaborations aren't that, but are looking toward thinking about where does this intersect with the bigger picture, and how do we create a network of different kinds of support, really across the field. We have specifically avoided trying to have an American-centered scope on this. A lot of the submissions, especially in the early stages, did come from the regional area around us, but we really wanted to present how is this going to be different if you are not an American institution, even though that was what we were most familiar with. And so we sought that out from peer reviewers in particular, and really tried to get peer reviewers who are not from within the US. And yeah, I see Hannah responding to Andrea in the chat, but definitely local history is a big area. Most of that so far has come from museums because that's where I have contacts. But we'd love to see more of that kind of approach. And I think this is where, like, you know, the connection with you all is useful as well, because there is so much more. I feel like there's a very different national identity toward how local history works with academic institutions in different parts of the world. And I'd love to see more of that come out.
That's really fantastic. I just want to reiterate, you know, your call to the room here and also to the participants online, you know, to submit to your fantastic project, because I think, you know, it's something that it is really worth, you know, keep on building up. So thank you so much, Hannah and Beth, again. I think that's what we have only time for, but thank you so much again for sharing your knowledge with us. It has been really a fantastic talk, and I just applaud you again. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much to all, and see you in 2 weeks' time.